There's nothing new in this. This is the way the Great Commission started in the beginning, after Jesus made a man and a woman, performed the wedding service himself in the Garden of Eden, and then told them to go and fill the earth, multiply, be fruitful. That's the Great Commission in the first chapter of Genesis.
Isn't that something?
And all through the Bible, you see that principle unfold. And finally, it becomes the last command Jesus gave to the church.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, we have, especially in this generation, there's a real fear of becoming involved in evangelism. What advice would you give to someone, a young Christian, who is afraid to get involved?
Well, show them as best you can how you are not afraid, at least to give your testimony and to pray. That's the way to alleviate the anxiety of those that are with you. But you have to be honest and not try to be something you're not. And they will begin to realize what is the essence of your lifestyle. That's always what you're doing. It's not something highly technical. It's not a campaign or a well-described program. It's a way of life. It's the way you live every day. And the more that you can break that down into relationship close enough so that they can understand it, and you can talk about it and ask questions, and you go from there. It's just the way.
I think I've read this about you, that you would often just grab a bunch of young men, you would take them down to the streets in Lexington.
Yes, I did for 25 years.
And you would do evangelism right on the street.
Why, certainly. Jesus did.
Yeah.
Jesus did teach sometime in the synagogue, but most of his ministry was with the people where he was walking and talking by the way. And I've tried to do that. I wish I could have been more effective and with them more. I'm certainly not wanting to be an example of this, but at least I know what I'm supposed to be doing. And so getting a group of students in my office when I began to teach at Asbury was what I had been doing in an unofficial way with just a few people before. But that group would get acquainted with each other. They would disciple each other. You see, in a family, you learn from each other. And we would go over on the streets of Lexington, and we had many experiences over there that were unusual, that were...
Tell us one of those.
Well, I've met people on the streets of Lexington in a conversation that would develop into the point where we could talk about the gospel, and we would just kneel down and pray right there on the street. And I remember one of the men that was in a group, he prayed with us, and later he went on to the university and got involved with the Campus Crusade, because when we broke up the meeting, I wanted one of the students to have to continue to follow him up. I always wanted these guys to have someone to relate to. And he started meeting with him, and he got involved in Campus Crusade. And a few months after that, I was over in Lexington preaching on the street, and someone that didn't really know what we were doing thought we were having some kind of a rally, a political something, and they reported us to the police. And so the man at the desk that evening didn't know that I'd already talked to the chief of police, and he'd been giving me permission to do this, but he didn't know that. So he sent a squad car over to see what was going on, and he pulled up over the curb there in front of the bus station where we were standing. And it scared some of my students, and no one knew what to expect. And we told him we were just preaching the gospel, but he did say we didn't have permission, and he didn't know that we already had. But so we stopped, and someone down the street came up and said, "Would you like to come into my little apartment and you can finish up what you're doing?" And some of the boys did go down there and have a little Bible study, which continued for a week or two. But anyway, that was what a man that had been some months before in our meeting, and then got involved over at the university, and eventually got involved in the Campus Crusade, and in some way got a job at the university. And he heard that there had been some excitement down in the center of town the night before, and he said, what was it? He said, well, somebody must have been yelling or speaking down there, and the crowd had gathered. He says, well, who was it? Do you know? He says, I don't know who it was, but someone said he was from the seminary over in Wilmore. He says, I know that man. That's Dr. Coleman. So he wrote me a letter, and he said, I heard about what had happened here the other night, and he said, I want you to know what's happened to me. He came over, then I wrote him back and said, well, come and be with us the next Friday night. He did. He showed up one night, and I saw him standing over there in a leather coat, and I said, would you like to come up and talk to us? He did. He stepped up there and gave his testimony. You know, you never know what's going to expect on the street. It's not the best way to evangelize. It's probably one of the worst ways today because most people are too busy to listen. Yeah. And it's not very glamorous, but it at least a way. It may be better than nothing, though.
Oh, yes.
And it's a good way to teach students. These students were with me. I never went by myself. You know where I learned that? I learned that from Jesus. Jesus always had people with him. If it's not a crowd, at least a few.
Yeah.
And that's what I tried to do. For many years, I always had these little groups I meet with at the seminary. I was paid to teach in the classroom, but my real ministry was making disciples.
I've heard, too, that not only did you take them out, but you had special prayer meetings, too.
Oh, yes. We'd meet in the morning at 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
On a campus, you don't have any competition at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But the principle is just to get together with some people who have a heart to learn. Mm-hmm. They don't have to know much, but if they're willing to learn, that's what's necessary. You got to be willing to trust the Spirit of God to lead you in the way of truth. And so the Bible becomes the focus of your group.
Mm. I asked you the question, what do you do with someone who's afraid? What about with someone who's eager and really wants to do this? What would you tell them? What would you say to them? Read your book, of course.
Well, get somebody and just start meeting with them. And I would look for people in my group who could then become a leader of a group the next year. Okay. And I began to do this. And actually, we would set up a class that they would have to do requirements. But finally, I had to bring, when I first started, people in from other places, like in Texas, where they hadn't had this kind of training. And we would go from there. But all of them eventually became teachers, just like I was, in different schools all over the country.
That's amazing.
And
do you know how many? Do you have an idea? That would be an amazing thing to know.
I've kept in touch with some of them.
That's wonderful.
I have to say, I'm not good at keeping up in email with everybody, but I can still remember them. And when it comes to mind, I can still pray for them.
If you were to put together a list of books that you would recommend, somebody who has a passion to do what we're talking about here, to evangelize and to make disciples, what would be maybe 2 or 3 or 4 of those books that you would say are must-reads? Of course, the Bible.
Well, of course, the Bible is the only real text that you can trust word for word as the Word of God. But I would take the little book by Brother Lawrence, The Practice of the Presence of God. It's just a little small book, which was not written by Brother Lawrence. It was written by people who knew him and letters that he had written to them. It's a very short book, but he found the secret of being in the presence of God as much working in the kitchen of this monastery where he worked as when he was on his knees taking the Blessed Sacrament. Now, that's the way to keep a heart that's full of the Spirit. A book that I've read over and over again, and I've read it with my family. My wife loved the book, The Pilgrim's Progress. Mm-hmm. I've read it many times, and I keep finding things that help me understand it in the practical ways, because it's just an effort to try to show this people and the circumstances we meet along the trail on the way to the celestial city. Christian, the pilgrim, started out by reading the Bible and realized that he was under judgment of God, and so he resolved to flee the city of wrath and to seek a place at the end of the life that would be heaven, called the celestial city. Amen. That's a book I think everybody can read, and it's in different translations. You can get it in a children's edition. My wife loved it too, and she loved to teach that book. Mm-hmm. And she was having another group that she was beginning to teach before she died just 3.5 years ago. She was a better teacher than I was. She had more patience, and she was a better example of everything that I tried to teach. But I always tell my students, if you can't out-marry yourself, you haven't got enough sense to be a preacher. And I'm exhibit number one. But I had a wonderful wife.
That's good. Yes, I remember her. She was.
Yeah.
She was a wonderful woman.
Beautiful girl.
I know that I was talking with June Eisman today, and June Eisman would put your book on that list of books that must be read.
Her heart.
But she told me that Billy Graham actually said, this is the best book written on evangelism.
Well, I don't know what Billy said about it. I know he wrote the introduction to the book, and I quote him in the book. But I know he believes in it. And that's one reason the book has been widely read, because he recommended it.
Yeah.
And we taught this book in the schools of evangelism all over the world.
I know you came to Kinshasa and taught it.
That's
and
right.
It was a wonderful time. So many pastors were there. I think we were at the Lycée Shaumba, which was where you taught. It was a wonderful time. That's been about, 30, 40 years ago now.
Many years ago, yes.
You knew the founders of Evangelism Resources, Willis and Thelma Braun.